Chapter 8. Greybeard Holt is a fighting man, I've heard common talk, that Greybeard Holt cuts his hair with a carving knife and fork. Fare thee well, Greybeard Holt, fare thee well, I say. Fare thee well, Greybeard Holt, tomorrow's another day. Will hit a final chord on the mandola as he finished the last words, letting the notes ring on. Delia clapped and laughed delightedly. "You're very good," she said, with a note of surprise in her voice. "You should come over to the tavern and sing sometime." Will shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. "Your mother wouldn't really appreciate my emptying her bar with my singing and playing." To tell the truth, he was sure that the idea of singing and playing amusing folk songs in a tavern didn't sit with a ranger's dignity or air of secretiveness. He wasn't totally sure that he should even be playing to Delia when he came to think of it. But she was pretty and friendly, and he was young and just a little lonely, and he decided that he would give himself a little leeway in the matter. They were sitting on the veranda of his cabin. It was late afternoon, and the autumn sun was slanting low in the west, the light dappled by the half-bare branches of the trees. In the past week, since the banquet with the Scandian crew, Delia had begun to take her mother's place in delivering his evening meal. This evening, as she'd arrived, he'd been sitting practicing the instrumental break from Greybeard Holt, a complex sequence of 16th notes played in a driving rhythm. She'd asked him to play it again and sing it as well. The song was a traditional one, originally titled Old Joe Smoke, and it was about an unwashed, unkempt herder who slept among his goats to stay warm. When Will first began to learn the mandola, he had jokingly retitled it Greybeard Holt, as a comment on his mentor's unkempt hair and beard. "But doesn't Ranger Holt object to you making fun of him like that?" Delia asked, a little wide-eyed. Holt's grim reputation was known throughout the kingdom. The idea of satirizing him seemed a dangerous one to her. Will shrugged. "Oh, Holt's not as serious as you might think. He actually has quite a sense of humour," he said. "He was certainly chuckling the time he made you spend all night up a tree for singing that song," came a voice from behind him. It was a familiar voice, low-pitched, feminine, and with a unique cadence that reminded Will of a stream flowing over smooth stones. He recognized it at once and leapt to his feet, turning towards the speaker where she had approached the end of the little porch. "Alyss," he said, a delighted grin spreading across his face. He stepped to meet her, his hands out in greeting, and she took them in her own as she stepped onto the veranda. She was tall and very elegant, dressed in a beautifully cut white gown. It was the official diplomatic service uniform, and its simple lines belied its stylishness, while it set off her slender, long-legged figure to perfection. Her ash-blonde hair was straight and shoulder-length, falling either side of her face and framing her features. Grey eyes sparkled quietly at a private joke between her and Will. The picture was completed by a straight nose, a firm chin, and a full mouth that echoed the hint of amusement and genuine pleasure in her eyes. They stood wordlessly for a moment, delighted to see one another again. Alyss was one of Will's oldest friends, having been raised, as he was, a ward of Redmont Fife. In fact, when Will had returned to Redmont, heartsore at his parting from the Princess Cassandra, they had gradually become somewhat more than friends. The graceful apprentice diplomat had sensed his need for warmth and feminine company and affection, and had been more than happy to supply all three. It hadn't progressed past some tentative embraces and kisses in the moonlight, and perhaps because of that there was a sense of unfinished business between them. Delia, seeing their obvious pleasure at each other's company, sensed the relationship and reluctantly surrendered. She was realist enough to know that she was pretty and vivacious and probably the most attractive girl of her age on the island. But this elegant blonde in the soft white gown was more than pretty. She was poised, graceful, and, in a word, beautiful. There was no contest, she thought resignedly. And just as things had been starting to thaw with this interesting and attractive young man. "What are you doing here?" Will finally found his voice and led Alyss to where he and Delia had been sitting. The village girl noted that he retained his hold on one of Alyss's hands, and she made no move to break the contact. "Oh, just a routine diplomatic pouch from the court," she said, tossing her head to signify that her mission was an unimportant one. "They're going out to half the fifes, nothing earth-shattering. I heard you were here at Seacliff, so I traded assignments with another courier so I could come see you." She glanced meaningfully over his shoulder, raising one exquisite eyebrow to remind him of his manners. Will realized that he had forgotten all about Delia, and now he turned hurriedly, knocking the mandola over where he had leant it against his chair. There was a moment of confusion as he regathered it. At least, thought Delia, it meant he had to let go of the perfect apparition's hand. "I'm so sorry," he said in a rush. "Alyss, this is Delia, a friend of mine here. Delia, this is Courier Alyss, one of my oldest and dearest companions." Delia winced inwardly at the dearest, but smiled valiantly as she took Alyss's proffered hand. It was smooth and warm, of course, with a surprisingly strong grip. "Pleased to meet you," she said, and Alyss smiled, knowing that Delia was anything but pleased. "How do you do?" she said. Will looked from one of them to the other, rubbing his hands uncertainly, not sure what to do next. Then his delight in seeing Alyss again took over. "So, are you staying long? Will you have time for me to show you the island?" he asked, and Alyss shook her head regretfully. "Just tonight and tomorrow," she said. "There's a formal banquet tomorrow, but I'm free tonight, and I thought—" She let the sentence hang, and Will seized the opportunity eagerly. "Well then, dine with me tonight." He gestured towards the cabin behind them. "I'll ask Edwina if she can cater for another person." "Edwina?" Alyss repeated, her mouth half smiling again. She glanced at the cabin, wondering if Will kept a tribe of women here with him. Delia answered before Will could explain. "My mother," she said. "We run the local tavern." She smiled over brightly at Will. "I can tell her if you like. It'll be no trouble for her at all, and it's time I was getting back anyway." Will hesitated, not sure how to handle this turn of events. "Oh, well, good. Then having left it just a shade too long, he added, "Why not join us? We can all have dinner together." Delia felt a small thrill of triumph as the smile on Alyss's face faded slightly, and for a moment she was tempted to accept. But she realized almost immediately that this small triumph was likely to be the only one she would enjoy that evening. "No, I'm sure you have lots to discuss together. You don't want me along." Alyss, she noticed, made no move to contradict her. Will, a little awkwardly, said, "Well, if you're sure then." He sensed the tension in the air, but had no idea what to do about it. Delia was already gathering up the small earthenware pot that she had brought for his evening meal. "I'll take this back," she said. "It's just a stew, and I'm sure Mother will want to do something special for an old friend of the Rangers." "That's great," Will replied automatically, completely missing the irony in her tone. His eyes were still fastened on Alyss. Delia waited a second or two, then asked, "What time would you like to dine?" Once again, Will was uncertain, and Alyss answered for him. "I have a meeting with the Baron first," she said, "and I'd like to settle into my quarters and have a bath before that. Perhaps in 2 hours' time?" "2 hours it is then," Delia replied. Then she added to Will, Shall I ask Dennis to bring over a couple of bottles of wine as well? Dennis was the cellarman at the tavern. Will smiled at her, welcoming the idea. That'd be great. Thanks, Delia, he said. She smiled, nodded a farewell to Alyss, and turned away, walking quickly towards the village. Why on earth did you suggest that? She asked herself softly as she went. It was almost as if she were trying to make matters worse for herself, she thought, adding bitterly, Perhaps you could come back and light some romantic candles for them as well. She glanced back once as she rounded the edge of the grove, but Will and Alyss were paying no further attention to her. Sourly, she noted that they were holding hands once more. You're making quite a name for yourself, Alyss said, smiling at Will across the dinner table. He hesitated as he poured her another glass of the excellent white wine. Paradoxically, Delia had chosen the very best she could find in her mother's cellars. I'm just blundering through, he said. It's all a little overwhelming, really. Alyss's steady gaze told him that she saw through his pretense of diffidence. Inviting a wolf-ship crew to a banquet, she said, preventing a pitched battle by handing over a few beasts and a skin or two of wine. I'd say you handled things pretty well. Oh, Scandians aren't so difficult to deal with once you know them, Will replied. Then he grinned at her. He was actually quite proud of the way he had handled the potentially ugly situation. Besides, he added, it was worth it to see all those stuffy knights and their ladies sitting down to dine with a crew of bloodthirsty corsairs. Alyss frowned slightly as she ran her finger round the top of her wineglass. Wasn't that a bit risky? She asked. After all, anything could have happened with that mix of people. Will shook his head firmly. Not once Gundar had given me his word as a helmsman. No Scandian will ever break that oath, and I knew Norris would keep his people under control. It was the least he could do, he added meaningfully. Alyss picked up on the unspoken message and raised her eyebrows in a question. Will hesitated a moment, not wanting to air Seacliff's dirty linen in public. Then he realised that Alyss was a member of the diplomatic service and accustomed to hearing secrets far more important than this one. Norris and the Baron had let things become very slack around here. They wouldn't have stood a chance in battle. Their men were badly trained, badly drilled, and out of condition. At least Norris realised the fact and went along with the banquet idea. And a good idea it was, Alyss said quietly. Will pursed his lips thoughtfully. I suppose it helped that I'd made the crossing of the Stormlight when I did, he said. I realised they were short of provisions and they mightn't last the winter without them. By doing things my way, they didn't have to fight for them, and they got to go to a banquet as well. He grinned at the memory once more. So they're safely out of the way? Alyss asked casually. Will shook his head. They're still butchering and smoking the meat, so it will see them through the winter, he said. They'll be at Bitterroot Creek for another 2 or 3 days, then they'll be on their way. Does that mean there's still a danger to the Fife? She asked, but Will hurried to reassure her on that score. Gundar's oath still holds, he said. I trust him totally. He grinned as he added, particularly as he knows I'm a personal friend of the Scandian Obial. You'll still report on Norris's neglect of his duty, won't you? Alyss asked. Like the Rangers, the courier's main allegiance was to the king. Will nodded. I'll have to, he said, but at least I can report that he's learnt his lesson. His men have been drilling non-stop since the morning after the banquet, and that was unpopular timing, I can tell you. In another month or so, he'll have them whipped into shape. So things are in good shape here? Alyss said, then added casually, there'd be no problem if you had to leave for a while? Will was reaching for the wine flask as she said the last few words. His hand froze in midair, and he met her eyes. They were serious now, with no hint of the humour and warmth that had been so evident earlier. This, he realised, was business. "Leave," he said, and she nodded. "It's no accident that I'm here, Will. Oh, there were some routine documents to deliver, but Holt and Crowley specifically asked me to take this assignment and give you a message. You're being reassigned." Will felt a sudden stab of doubt at the words. Perhaps his handling of the Scandian situation hadn't been quite as clever as he thought. Alyss saw the worry written plainly on his face and hastened to reassure him. "It's no punishment, Will. They were very pleased with the way you handled things, Holt in particular. They have a temporary assignment they need you for." He felt the weight of doubt lift at her words. "What sort of assignment?" Alyss shrugged. "I don't know the full details myself yet. It's all highly confidential," she said. "As I said, they wanted me to deliver the message because I was an old friend. That way, people won't begin wondering why you should suddenly disappear after a visit from a courier. They'll just put it down to the normal Ranger liking for secrecy. Hopefully, they'll think my visit was purely social, particularly with your girlfriend Delia to stoke the fires of gossip." Will coloured slightly. "She's just a friend," he protested awkwardly. But Alyss didn't answer. She was pointing at the dog, which had been lying contentedly on the warm stones beside the fire. Now she was awake, ears flattened against the side of her head, her teeth bared. A low, rumbling growl sounded in her chest. Her gaze was fixed on the door of the cabin. "There's someone outside," Will said softly. Motioning for Alyss to remain where she was, he rose and moved silently to the door.